who are from the Center for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins University, Marissa Castellano and Sam Stringfield. Welcome both to those of you here in the audience and to those who have tuned in on the webcast, which is being broadcast from the National Center's website. This speaker series is sponsored by the Office of Vocational and Adult Education of the U.S. Department of Education in collaboration with the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education of the Ohio Department of Education and the Ohio State University chapter of Omicron Tau Delta. As always, the views expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily any of the sponsoring organizations. Johns Hopkins and the Center for the Social Organization of Schools is one of the associate partners of the two national centers. And Sam and Marissa have been working with the University of Minnesota since the new national centers were established in the year 2000. They have been working on a longitudinal study that has been looking at schools that have incorporated various models of career and technical education as part of a whole school reform strategy. They have been focusing on schools that primarily serve young people at risk of not benefiting from their educational experiences. Although this is the focus of their study, it is also the focus of their professional careers. Her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, where she participated in and co-authored some of the reports and studies coming from the previous National Center for Research in Vocational Education at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley. Marissa has been able to combine the best of both worlds. While she is a staff member of the Center for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins, she actually lives in Santa Rosa, California, in the heart of the wine country of California. And Sam actually lives in Baltimore, where he is not only education, he participates in the development of local policy. He's a member, and I want to get this name correctly, of the City of Baltimore New Board of School Commissioners. I find the inclusion of the word new intriguing, and perhaps Sam will tell us a little bit why that is in the title of that board. Sam also has a California connection. He is co-director of the Program on Integrated Reform at the University of California at Santa Cruz. In fact, Sam is associated with so many centers and programs that attempting to list them all would just confuse you. Prior to his present position, he was a teacher, a program evaluator, a faculty member at Tulane, and coordinator of the Denver office of the Northwest Regional Educational Laboratory. Sam will be the first speaker, and the title of their presentation is CTE as a Driving Component of Whole School Reform. Review of research and first-year observations of successful practices at work. After Sam and Marissa have made their presentation, we'll take questions, and please, before you ask your questions, wait till you have this hand mic in your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Let me begin by saying that it's a pleasure for both Marissa and myself to be here today. This is a very high-tech presentation that we understand is going out on the web. In addition to with a live audience, this is a first for both of us. I think there are a lot of wonderful things about technology and the opportunity to experience something beyond the immediate room, and we're pleased and delighted to be here and doing that. Let me also say to those of you who are out there in webland that however good or not so good this presentation winds up being, you've missed a spectacular weekend in Columbus, Ohio, and if you ever wanted to know a reason to go to Ohio State University, all you had to do was walk around the campus this weekend. We're here doing a study, and we had a wonderful opportunity to take a walk across the beautiful campus of the Ohio State University yesterday. It was just, it was a breathtaking autumn day. So I'd say that we should begin by saying this report is a report on the early findings after almost 2 years of a 5-year study examining how career, and technology education reforms can be merged into whole school reform. And now we're going to see exactly how technologically, it worked. We've now tested the outer boundaries with my computer know-how. Dr. Castellano and I are making the presentation. We will provide a review of the research on the intersection of whole school reform and CTE. And let me say that the 5-year study began with the conduct of a very large literature review, trying to look for examples and explore where CTE has and has not worked well, and in particular where it has intersected. You're probably aware with the federal government over the last few years has a lot of interest in whole school reform, and that I think it's based on the last, say, 30 or 40 years of research that suggests that sometimes individual reform efforts, say Title I pull-out programs or something like that, can year after year after year show positive effects, and yet if you look at the whole school, it's just not clear that those effects are sustaining or generalizing. And so there's been a push to use the CTE and other kinds of Title I, special education. There's been a general push to try to integrate those in a more thoughtful way, so you don't just have a wonderful CTE program, but that you integrate that into a larger whole school effort to upgrade the quality of education for all the children. We obviously, I would say the other thing that's part of a national push is to measure these kinds of reform effects on some large-scale whole school level. And I don't think it's possible to be an educator in the year 2001 and not notice that a lot of this increasingly has to do with some sort of measured outcome, and in particular local or state-mandated tests of one type or another, sometimes nationally norm tests, but certainly tests of student outcomes. Let me say the other thing about our study that is probably a little unusual is that it's focused on at-risk children. All of our sites that we'll be talking about are in areas that have high concentrations of either economically depressed families, poor folks, or persons of historically underserved minority groups, African American, Hispanic, second language learners, so forth, and so on. And I think part of the idea is that if, these are just groups that are historically have had sort of a harder road to hoe along the way to being full participants in our wonderful and vibrant democracy. Technology. So again, the purpose of the study is to examine and report on programs that are attempting to improve education of students at risk that are using CTE and other similar things in local context. Let me do just a quick outline of the presentation. This is tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So we're going to review studies of selected reforms, and they're listed on the overhead here: tech prep, curriculum integration, high schools at work, urban learning centers, career academies, and career pathways. We don't claim that these are all the examples of efforts to have reform using CTE to reform whole schools. We just say that these are examples of them, and as is always the case when one is working on a finite budget, one chooses. And so we chose reforms that seem reasonably widely disseminated or plausibly working well to integrate CTE in the whole school reform. The practices, selected reform practices presented. We will talk about the implementation of school reforms, how they're getting started, and sometimes the before the beginning kind of things about how does one choose. Curriculum integration examples, and I think these have been a lot of fun to go out and actually observe. And frankly, at this point, sometimes it's more useful to go out and make the observations than it is to read the literature, because a lot of this is it seems like there's been a lot more talking about integration than there has been actual research on making the integration happen and work. But when you see it work, it's a beautiful thing. We have some examples of that, and by the end of the 5 years, we presumably will have more. Which career academies or pathways should one choose? The role of middle schools in making CTE work for at-risk children, and then making tech prep work. I think at core, as much as anything else, I think of myself as a research methodologist, and so let me stop and just say just a little bit about when you design a study like this, what you're trying to do is integrate, make three different things work. And one is internal validity. All the way through your graduate program, you're drilled into things which you don't realize, but what they're really drilling on is internal validity and trying to make studies coherent so that the larger academic community will believe your results when it's over, that they have their internal structure that's plausible. You then have issues of external validity. If you design the study well and conduct it, would anybody out in the real world give a hoot about it? Has it got anything to do with plausible options for real educators on the one hand and real policy people in D.C. or state capitals, wherever, or for that matter, principals, on the other hand, and trying to find some balance between internal and external validity issues. It's always interesting to me, because some of the people out there might be graduate students, to observe how much of the work people, the training people have, is about internal validity. And when you're dealing with a teacher or a principal or a school board member, what they really care about is external validity. They want to know the practical nuts and bolts. So can you make this darn thing work? Then those two form two legs of what's a triangle, and the third leg is always funding. And so that the craft of being a methodologist is trying to find a way to make external validity real, internal validity tight, and then do it within this nasty little thing called money. So here's where we started. The sampling. The longer I do research, the more I think that sampling is destiny. And if you don't get this one right, then nothing else after this matters anyway. So we have a nice, simple 4-level sampling frame. And the first one is promising CTE and whole school reform design integrations. So Dr. Castellano, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but put a lot of work into finding examples around the country of places where CTE was an integral part of making high schools, middle schools, and community colleges a more relevant whole, particularly for at-risk children. And so we contacted every single one of 50 state CTE coordinators. We then looked for other evidence to support that, in fact, when sites were nominated as exemplars, that there was credible evidence to suggest that they were. We then looked at things like test scores and other things. Find ways to get a credible population from which to draw that met our definition. Then on top of that, they had to be serving at-risk populations. It turned out once you describe the criteria, I've actually been involved in several longitudinal studies the last few years, and if you describe the criteria, a good aggressive state superintendent or CTE director or Title I director, whoever it is you're talking to, will often say they have one, and then you go to the site and you wonder what on earth made them think this thing serves that population. We went to a wonderful CTE school here in Ohio that really was nominated to us, and so we sent a team out to visit before we brought them into the longitudinal sample. It was a wonderful school, beautiful facilities. They do great things, and as far as we could tell, there wasn't a poor kid for 10 miles. So out of the sample. So serving at-risk populations. In each case, we were looking for a trio of schools. We're looking for a middle school that is doing reform, that feeds a high school that's doing reform, that feeds into a community college that is engaged in trying to do state-of-the-art community college work, that in turn has articulation agreements in similar ways of connecting strongly to those very schools that we're following. Because we're interested not just in good schools and how they are doing these things, but how they're articulating across the levels, how the middle school feeds the high school, how the high school both feeds and builds off of the community college. And so we're looking for places that do those. And when we get a little lower, we'll talk about creating what's effectively a synthetic cohort to watch students as they move across both within this middle school and within the high school, within the community college, and then as they span those boundaries. There's a lot of research on dropping out that suggests that dropping out is not an event, it's a process, and that people start the process of dropping out in middle school, and often the transition to high school just accelerates the whole thing. And so we were looking at threesomes. At each site, we're following 3 cohorts across 4 years, and this is a synthetic cohort idea. And so the youngest cohort started a year ago, 14 months ago, I suppose, as 7th graders. We'll follow them through 10th grade. How are they doing the last 2 years of middle school and the first 2 years of high school, to get a sense both of what the middle school is doing that is relevant to children thinking about careers and starting to think about a practical world beyond middle school, which, if you haven't been a middle schooler or had one in your house lately, to get them to think about anything about what a researcher would call the external validity of their lives is quite a step. But getting them thinking about the practicalities of their life and how education intersects with that. Then the high school and the uses that they are making, Perkins money or other ways to make the overall curriculum of the school as they start high school. So the high school. The second cohort is 9th through 12th grade. Obviously, this is a cohort picking up children as they start high school. What is their experience through 4 years of high school, and to what extent does this intersect with the issues of CTE? And in fact, do these whole school reforms guide both the poorest and the richest, but obviously we have a particular interest in the less historically advantaged, and then the historically lowest achieving, historically highest achieving kids? How does that work through? Again, we have an interest in the historically lower achieving, but that need not intersect completely with, and does not, with issues of poverty and so forth. So this cohort we're following through high school. In some of the schools that we were in historically, you would have expected half of them to drop out. Hopefully, because they're in particularly strong schools, the great majority of them will in fact finish high school on. So we will be following this cohort through the time at which they would graduate, be expected to graduate from high school. The third cohort began a little over a year ago in 11th grade, and we'll follow them through 2 years of post-high school. So if a student, our ideal student for the purposes of this study, starts 11th grade, finishes right on time, and then actually would finish 2 years of community college, or 2 years of military service, or 2 years of other, if they'd been here this weekend, they'd have gone to Ohio State if they could have gotten in. But people following them out through the first 2 years post-high school. So you develop what's called a synthetic cohort, and that is to say that within a 4-year period you can actually follow what's 8 years of education by following the progress of these 3 different groups in the same context, with the context of the middle school feeding the high school, and then with the local community college involvement. The study that I designed so far would simply be following a total of 9. As it turned out, we happen to have added a 10th school because we have a community that has essentially a vocational school component that is off-site. So we added that to it. So we have essentially 2 high schools at one of the sites. But we'd be following 10 schools across the 4 years of field work in an effort to build. Some people call it transferability, other people would say generalizability. We have replication sites that we are following in less detail, but nonetheless following, and particularly quantitatively, but I think we make a total of 2 visits to each of the Miles would say stepwise replication sites. They have conducting similar reforms. So for each of the longitudinal sites, one of them, for example, is doing high schools that work. Well, we have a replication site in a similarly at-risk context that is also doing high schools that work and integrating that with the CTE efforts. So we have a matched set of replication sites. We then have control sites. These are controls for the original 9, now 10 schools, and so we have within that region of that state, a demographically similar set of schools that are not involved in a whole school reform that integrates CTE. As far as we can tell, and the literature on this has been fairly consistent for 20 years, there are no schools who aren't involved in several different change efforts of one type or another at every given moment of the year and decade. So the effort isn't to find some place that's doing nothing, but it's to find places that are demographically similar that aren't involved in whole school reform that integrates CTE with the whole school reform. The data collection effort is quite substantial. We're involved in quantitative outcome measurement, following the students again with the 7th grade, looking back a year or 2 before that, how are they doing, and then following through 4 years. Same with the 9th graders and the 11th graders, and it's quite a challenge. We've already made had the lawyers and whoever else sign all the forms about moving from 10th grade through community college and the parental consent letters, and a person could spend their lives doing this thing if they really wanted to. But it allows for if you do the hard work up front, it allows it to be a little easier out in the out years as the kids in fact move from the high school to the community college or the middle school to the high school or whatever. But we're following quantitative outcomes, attendance, achievement, levels of certification within the CTE world, those kinds of things, following them with the cohorts across those years I hadn't mentioned it yet, but we have different levels of data gathering within each site with interviews with superintendents, principals, program leaders within the school level, focus groups of teachers and students. And then there are a few students who are actually going to follow and what we call shadowing, and you follow this student for a whole day every time you're back in that city. And then across the 4 years, you spend several days with a child who was very likely, in the case of 7th grader, to be on track to become a CTE child. In the case of 11th grade, they're already in CTE, and so you follow them ideally as they go through the high school and the community college, or wherever they go. All of these efforts are designed, on the one hand, to improve the internal validity of the study in the case of the control sites, and the external validity or transferability or generalizability in the case of the replication sites. And now I'm supposed to say that in the wonderful world of high tech, if you have more questions about methods, we can answer them during the question and answer section, or what would be much more fun is to get out your computer and at this address, www.nccte.org/programs/index/ASP. And when you get there, look under what makes it work. And you'll find a description of our study, and within the next few weeks, I believe, you'll find a description of the presentation we're going to make, which is drawn from our, I don't know if they call it midterm, but it's the end of 2nd year report, our interim report on the progress of this study. Also within the next few weeks there, you'll be able to find a wonderfully detailed, rich, thick review of, I have no idea how many bazillion studies that were in the literature review that we completed. I think it is now time for me to introduce Dr. Castellano, and all the technical things about Marisa have already been said, so let me just say that we are very lucky to get to work over the long haul with a fine scholar, Dr. Castellano.
Thank you, Sam. What I'm going to be doing is going over the various reform designs that were listed in the very beginning. One reason, there's 6 of them, and one reason we chose these 6 to talk about today over the bazillion that are in the literature review is that our schools that we'll be talking about are implementing these specific reforms. So when we get to the practices that these schools are doing within these reforms, you can sort of link it back to the context of reform that they're implementing. So first of all is tech prep. Well, I'm not sure why this didn't come up, but the first thing is the essential features. For each reform, we're going to go through the essential features of it, then the implementation challenges, and the outcomes that the literature has. Well, this is the next one. But first, the essential features. I'm sure you're all familiar with tech prep. It's an articulation agreement among consortium members. There's schools, school districts, and community colleges that come together and create some kind of agreement to create a sequence of courses across high school and community college that lead to either a degree or a post-secondary certificate. There's usually a common core of academics in tech prep. It's proficiency in math, science, and communications, and there's often a placement in employment component. Now the implementation challenges. Every one of these reform designs has some challenges involved to it. For tech prep, parents and students often balk at these strictly defined sequences that seem to lead kids into community college. This is America. We all think my child will go to a university, and for historical reasons, the community college is usually considered the lower level post-secondary. That's not always true. A lot of community colleges are more technologically literate and advanced than some 4-year universities, but that's not common knowledge. The common concern is my child will go to a university. So parents and students themselves often don't like the idea that this program my child is in is leading him or her to the community college. There's also the lack of confidence by community college faculty that these high school courses are equivalent to the community college courses. They often tell the students, you know, I know that you took this in high school, but if you really want to know this subject, you've got to learn it from me. Third, the lack of student awareness. And that's just, we have found in our study, and I'm sure in other studies it's also been found that students don't always know that they're earning college credits. They are told, but it isn't something that kind of sticks with them. So at the end of their senior year, you can ask them if they realize they've earned 6 to 9 college credits, and they don't always know that. So that's not, they're not necessarily thinking of that community college as a place to go after high school, because it hasn't been told to them often enough that they've already earned 6 to 9 credits sometimes of community college credits. So that's another thing that really needs to be worked on. Tech prep outcomes. These again are outcomes from our lit reviews, the studies that have been done on tech prep, and these particular findings come from our colleague Deborah Bragg, who also is doing a study within the National Research Center, and these outcomes are fairly fresh. This is a very recent study. Compared to non-tech prep graduates of mature tech prep programs are more likely to enter 2-year post-secondary education. They're more likely to be employed, and more likely to be employed full-time. They're more likely to hold highly skilled jobs, and also to receive larger wage increases. The next reform I want to talk about is also part of the Perkins 3 legislation. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with Perkins 3. It's the federal authorization for vocational education in both secondary and post-secondary schools. So the essential features of curriculum integration, the main thing is just to increase the relevance of academics for vocational students. Communication skills, math, and science. If you teach them in the context of the vocational program the students are in, it's believed that it'll be more engaging to students. They'll actually be more motivated to learn these things. Implementation challenges. Well, it takes a lot of teacher planning, a lot of teacher team time to get the integration happening. You've got to get academic and vocational teachers together to work on what these subjects have in common. How can I use my math in your carpentry class, and vice versa? And teachers don't have that kind of time often. There's also resistance among some academic and vocational teachers to the whole concept. Some academic teachers think that it's going to water down their curriculum, and this is the kind of thing that takes time to show that both sides actually can benefit from curriculum integration. Finally, high school graduation and college admission requirements often don't recognize or grant credit for integrated courses. And again, it's that idea that it's not as rigorous as the strictly academic courses. This isn't always true, but it depends on how it's structured and how the teachers work. And so we'll be giving examples of some ways that they have made it work at our schools in the study. Curriculum integration outcomes. There have not been rigorous studies that assess the effectiveness of curriculum integration. There's anecdotal evidence that engagement increases and even achievement, but studies on curriculum integration are hard to conduct because usually curriculum integration is not implemented just by itself. You'll see in later slides that it's usually a part of some of these other reform designs, so you can't really ferret out, well, how much of these results that we've seen have to do with the curriculum integration and how much have to do with other parts of those reform designs. So it's very difficult to say at this point. We're hoping that we can sort of try and share some of that out at these schools. Next is high schools at work. Again, some of these are very familiar to you, others may not be. High schools at work, the essential features here are rigorous vocational courses and more required academic coursework. High Schools at Work was developed by the Southern Regional Education Board. It's really a vocational student-based kind of reform. It assumes that the kids are in vocational programs, and what it tries to do is beef up the academics and make sure that vocational kids graduate with the same level of academic skills as kids in the other tracks, the college preparatory, etc. So there are high expectations and extra help for students to meet those expectations. There's common planning time provided for teachers so that they can work on curriculum integration and how their topics merge and how they can present that to students. There's usually an individualized advising system and the use of assessments to improve student learning. And that's really one of the nicer features of High Schools at Work, is that they gather data and they use the data to improve the program. That's a very important feature that not every reform design does, but it makes for a more informed decision-making process. The challenges within high schools at work, many vocational teachers report they need more professional development in order to do that type of integration. And most academic teachers lack a knowledge of and skills in the vocations. So they also need professional development so that they can be full partners in the process. Outcomes for high schools at work. Evaluations show that schools that implement the model faithfully usually see improved achievement and higher retention and post-secondary enrollment rates. Evaluation reports show improved NAEP scores for students who complete the high schools at work vocational concentration. And NAEP scores are the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So that is one of the methods that they use to collect data and make their decisions based on the results. There are some limitations to the data that we found as we were doing our lit review. For example, the High Schools at Work organization uses an older version of the NAEP test. And this may not seem like much, but what the artifact or what ends up happening is student results are not always really comparable to their results on the state-mandated tests. So it may look really good from the High Schools at Work assessment and may not look as great from the state-level mandated tests. Second, NAEP is only administered to those students who complete the High Schools at Work vocational concentration. So not all students in the school are taking the exam, and if kids say they started the vocational concentration but didn't finish it, they also don't take that exam. And that's kind of important because they were in there, they got some of the treatment at least, but they're not taking the exam, so that kind of affects the outcomes. Urban Learning Centers, this is another one of the CSRD reforms. CSRD is the Comprehensive School Reform Demonstration Act. It was passed by U.S. Congress about 5 years ago, and what it does is it provides money for schools, elementary through high school, to adopt some of these reform designs that are out there that are research-based. So they're not just any fly-by-night firm can put up a reform. They're usually based on research and have strong results. And there's a list of them on the CSRD website. Schools can look through the list and decide which of these reforms works best for their context, apply for a CSRD grant, and get money to implement it. So Urban Learning Centers is one of these. The essential features is what this one does is it houses pre-K through 12 all in one building, and that's in order to develop collaborative, articulated communities across the grades. The emphasis within Urban Learning Centers is on interdisciplinary curriculum, project-based learning opportunities, and school-to-work transitions. Implementation challenges here. A lot of parents and teachers are not ready to see that middle school building turn into a K through 12 building. They've got certain sentimental value with it as a middle school, or they're worried that their middle school kids, say a sixth grader, shouldn't be in the same school as a high school senior. They're worried about that kind of maybe bad influence. What we found at the school that it is in our study is, in fact, the older kids are acting almost as mentors for the younger kids, and there haven't been any of those kind of problems, but it's something to think about if Urban Learning Centers is something that's attractive to your school. It also takes a great deal of physical space. We're talking about a lot of students on one campus if it's going to be K through 12. A lot of coordination and scheduling as well. Outcomes for Urban Learning Centers, a high percentage of graduates go on to four-year colleges and universities. In fact, at the school in our study, 62% of the kids are actually going on to four-year colleges, and many of them go to the nearby private university. Most of the rest, and then by that I mean we're getting into the 90 to 95%, enroll in some form of post-secondary education or the military. Career academies. The essential features here, I'm sure this is also familiar to you, these are schools within schools where students stay with a core group of teachers over 3 or 4 years. Academy students take several courses together, both within their career-themed academy and also their academic core courses. Academic and vocational curriculum is integrated around a career theme. Partnerships with businesses build connections between school and work. Often career academies offer internships, mentorships, or job shadowing. And also there's teacher autonomy and professional development. There's much more teacher decision making in what kinds of professional development they need to either learn about the career that they are going to be trying to apply their social studies class to, or in teaming, what they call teaming and theming, where the teachers work together on curriculum integration. The implementation challenges within career academies is again, the rigor question. Can an integrated curriculum be as rigorous as my algebra class as is following the textbook that I've been doing for 10 years? Second, teachers require professional development to develop that integrated curricula, so there's got to be money and time for that. Teachers need to spend time in the workplace so that they can understand how their subjects are applied at work. So then you need release time, you need common planning periods. And finally, there's some scheduling challenges because these kids they're in a cohort. They go to all the same courses together over, say, 4 out of 6 periods. That leaves only 2 free periods. And there's usually within one academy, there's kids who want to be in band, kids who are in German 3, and that's only offered during the period that the academy meets. So there's all these kinds of challenges that need to be worked around. Also, master scheduling in terms of teacher common planning time. You've got to make sure that all the 4 or however many teachers are in that academy are able to meet at the same time. So it just takes a little acumen. It can be done. Outcomes for career academies. And these are pretty strong outcomes, especially for the at-risk populations. There's been reduced dropout rates, increased attendance, and more credits earned for at-risk students. There's an increased likelihood of on-time graduation for those minimally at risk of dropping out. And appropriately structured, academies lower risk-taking behavior, and that's drinking, dropping out of classes, not attending, increased school engagement and performance, and lower absenteeism. The final model that I want to go through is career pathways. Essential features here is this is a strategy that organizes high school curricula around a cluster of occupations that share similar skills and knowledge, although they might differ in the length of education and training required. An example here would be a machinist and an engineer. Both require a fairly different amount of education, but they are involved and interested in the same types of things, and so they would be in the same pathway. Also, the career pathways replace traditional college preparatory and vocational and general tracks. So instead of having those 3 tracks, what you've got instead are pathways. They form the context for interdisciplinary or integrated activities like senior projects. And these pathways also need strong connections with business and industry. Implementation challenges for career pathways. It's unknown. This is relatively new. At least within the research field. We can assume, given what we know from the other models, that there's going to be some resistance, again, from academic subject teachers, just like with curriculum integration, and also maybe with some parents and students who, again, might see pathways as a way of narrowing student choices rather than expanding them, which is really the goal. There's a lot of work to be done to convince the stakeholders within the education community of the advantages of some of these CTE reforms. What we're doing is telling you what we've seen and read about some of the challenges that parents, students, and teachers have towards some of these reforms, but they can be overcome. Outcomes within career pathways, again, no major studies have been undertaken on student outcomes, so we can't say at this point. But several states are now requiring that all high schools implement either pathways or career majors. So we figure that there's a lot more studies that are going to be conducted within the next few years, so more information should be forthcoming. And actually we hope that our contribution, at least one part of our contribution, will be some information on student pathways at the school in our study. Now Sam will tell you a little more about the study.
Marisa has been talking about general characteristics of the study and some of the reforms being attempted. I'm going to say a little bit about the demographics of a few of the schools. Let me return to a theme that I started a few minutes ago by saying that sampling is destiny. I'm reminding that Ben Franklin had one of his little afros, which I will change the gender on, but it doesn't really matter. you could change it just a little bit to say, she who marries in haste is allowed to regret it at her leisure. In a longitudinal study, if you don't pick a good, strong sample that exemplifies the things you're talking about, you have no shot from there on out. There just is no fixing it. So we were very careful about our site selection. We described calling and having interactions, mailings, whatever, with all 50 state CTE coordinators, then other steps after that, and then actually did site visits to the schools before we admitted them into either the longitudinal sample or the replication sample. Because again, if you make a mistake at the beginning, you're just toast the rest of the way through. There is no fixing it. So our three longitudinal sets of schools: middle school, high school, community college. I'm going to actually just describe the high school. If we have in our reports, we describe the others, but you remember that excuse me, that all of the students, whichever of the three cohorts they're in, go through high school and have at least 2 years of high school experience. And so I'll describe the high schools because obviously the feeder pattern, if you know that, you've got the core of it anyway. One of our sites is a comprehensive high school that's involved in hands-on reform using CTE-like skills. It's an implementing career pathways. It's a rural community comprehensive high school with a little over 2,000 students, about 400 of whom are migrant students. About half the kids are Hispanic, 40% white, and some percentage African American and Asian. And about half the kids are free or reduced price lunch. You're probably aware that in high schools, 48% free or reduced price lunch almost certainly means that the elementary rate is 60, 70, 80%. The high school kids are loath to fill that out. The second school is a vocational high school in a community that has, I believe it's either 5 or 6 high schools total. This is the one vocational school. It actually struggles with being sort of labeled that as in this is the place the non-college prep kids should be sent. They work with that and work around that pretty hard, and I think fairly successfully. They're implementing high schools that work, which Marissa's already said a little bit about. It's urban vocational high school, 1,500 kids, about half Hispanic, 30% African American, 57% free or reduced price lunch, and again, that's almost certainly a much lower figure than those same kids were when they were in elementary school, just because they aren't particularly interested in filling out the forms. The third school runs on an academy model, a high school, 700 students. This is, again, a K-12 physical facility with, I think, a little over 4,000 children in the whole thing, but the high school is 700 children in 3 different academies. By the time you combine Hispanic and African American, you have 100% of the children, and 94% of them are free or reduced priced lunch because they have this nice little thing about the kids have been there all along, and so they just sustain the paperwork as opposed to having to do something new every year. And so they have a rate that I think is probably not that different from the other two. It's just that that's what the records show. So we clearly have good, strong case for that these are at-risk environments. We are gathering qualitative and quantitative data to suggest that each one is doing as well or often a great deal better than you would have expected on outcome measures. And what we are then able to do is follow them over the years and see where they go. It's actually, I was thinking about this weekend. It's sort of an exciting moment in the study because we have good evidence that they have implemented the various career academies and the comprehensive high school that melds in CTE pretty heavily. Those kinds of things. We have, I think, strong evidence that they're off to a good footing. There's a lot of research. A lot of research over the last really 50 or 60 years. You can start with the 8-year study in the 1930s and come up through special strategies and other studies in the 1990s to suggest that somewhere surprisingly close to about half the schools in America that attempt one kind of famous reform or other, and particularly if they attempt to sort of homebrew a local reform, that often as few as 50% of them ever get past the initial planning stage. And they usually start with a lot of enthusiasm, how we're going to plan this year, next year we're going to start implementation, and literally 50% of them never get past the planning stage, and somehow they've burned themselves out or worn themselves out or whatever. All of those 3 longitudinal sites that we were discussing and the replication sites have clear evidence that they are doing the so it's gotten going. So this is kind of an exciting period to see, are they able to move toward institutionalization? Will the reform become deeper and broader? Or in fact, will it just sort of over time shrivel shrivel up and die on the vine. If it does, we should have a uniquely strong database to talk about how that has happened in these contexts. We're involved in a couple of other longitudinal studies that are not CTE based, and so we'll have some nice comparisons in addition to the controls that are built into this study. So let me just say a few things about implementation that are often general rules, but they're certainly true in these sites as well. These schools, at least they have gotten through the initial implementation by now, so we can talk about how they did that. We can do interviews with teachers and principals and superintendents. In every case, they began by reflecting on where they were and where they wanted reform to take them. You'd be surprised how rare this is, or how far from universal. One would think that this is the way it is. And I was engaged in another study a few years ago, and I had this idea that people started out with a map of where I am and where I want to go. And so if you thought of it literally as a map, so you go down this street, turn right, and get on the interstate and go 38 miles. I had the whole thing laid out in my mind how people did it. And my conclusion after we looked across a lot of schools, a lot of years, it was more like the group decided we got to get out of here, and they went out to the highway and stuck out their thumb, and the first car that actually slowed down, they got in, and wherever it went, that's where they went. And so they would take often reforms that have a lot of track record of succeeding, except they would take them and suddenly be surprised at what the major components of the reform were. You know, like, well, wasn't it written down? I mean, where was the secret here? So these schools, by contrast, had done a pretty good job of thinking about where they wanted to go, what were their local problems, what were the challenges that they faced that they wanted to overcome, and then went out and looked for a reform that actually matched up to those challenges, as opposed to sort of the latest trendy thing that was coming down the street. In every case, student achievement was central. I would say if there's one thing different about reforms, one of the two major things different about reforms in the 1990s and the early 21st century is the extent to which the statewide testing programs and the publishing of what the British would call raw league tables in newspapers had affected the way that people think about what is the job of schools, and that particularly the professionals in the schools can't afford to do something that has the published test scores go down because bad things happen to them. And I would say that's different from when I went through school, or in fact the studies we would do 15 years ago. So they were looking for student achievement gains was always central. Often the staff said they wanted a more collegial atmosphere, or at least something that wouldn't harm the existing level of collegiality. Building a professional development community. I'm just particularly fond of this and think it's a very smart thing to build in. That it's not just enough to do something to raise test scores. We've got to build a stronger community ourselves among the adults, and it's professional development is the lever that we have most available to us for doing that. Participatory decision-making was a common characteristic in these. We were talking last night about our sites, and one of the things that is actually relatively surprising to me about these sites is the scarcity of principals who were doing what in the Navy would be called driving the bridge, and that is that the head person telling everybody else what to do and stopping listening to anybody else. There's a wonderful, actually true story of the only U.S. Nuclear aircraft carrier that ever got run aground. The commander stopped listening to anyone else and was telling everyone what to do, and so people stopped telling him he was heading right toward a set of shoals, and so he grounded a multi-billion-dollar piece of equipment. The participatory decision-making is no small part of how we're going to get there, I think. And one of the surprising to me things about these schools was the extent to which the principals had bought into that as an absolute given before they went anywhere else. I think that actually helps all the things above there about the reflection on what are our strengths and what are our needs and how can data inform that. They selected reforms and elements of reforms that fit that vision and context, so that before they grabbed something, before they stuck their thumb out on the highway, they actually thought about where do we want to go and how are we going to get there. Amazing when technology works. Implementing reforms. First steps that they had in common. I just have a few examples here. One of the schools shows total quality management, TQM, a Deming kind of approach. Others actually were using pieces that would be called parts of TQM. They just didn't know it for whatever reason. But bringing all the stakeholders together, trying to involve everyone, identifying and focusing on problems, not on blame, measurement of everything that mattered. And since achievement was one of the things that mattered, looking pretty hard at what were the available test scores and so forth and so on. I'm sure all of you in this room know this, but there's this sort of, if it didn't matter so much, it would be an amusing thing about how Some of the Perkins 3 legislation calls for evaluations of how the kids are doing, and the last testing done in a lot of states is at 10th grade, and often the CTE career technology education stuff starts kicking in at the 11th grade, and so you're having an outcome measure that's actually a pretest. And how to deal constructively with that and move toward other measures that provide you a better assessment of how the thing that you're doing is working. And then using the results on an ongoing basis to further the process. I think at this point I'm actually going to hand back off to Marisa, and she's going to talk about some of the particular themes that have been emerging in some of our observations.
All the great actual practices that schools are implementing that seem to be working in charge of intelligence point to say, again, I'm going to do it step into the 5 years. So we hope to refine and possibly modify it as we go. First of all, curriculum integration in general, this is what one of the principles is. Again, remember the challenges of curriculum integration with getting the academic implications teachers to talk to each other. So what this principal decided to do is start with the teachers that want to collaborate. That way there's no top-down, you will integrate your curriculum. She found some teachers who wanted to collaborate with each other, and she provided them with common planning time. She also provided them with an extra stipend for their time that they spent developing that curriculum. By the time their curriculum had been implemented and had been refined, she gave them time to refine it. By then, other teachers had begun to ask, what are you doing and how is that going and how was that? And that usually interested other teachers. Then we talk with other teachers and they make their own little teams. And then that stipend circulated by the teachers. Because by then, they need extra money and they had already gotten their planning down. So at that point, the money went on to new groups of teachers who were interested in integrating their curriculum. So from here, we'll give a couple of examples. Computer literacy and health. Now, health is a subject matter, so you could really substitute any subject matter for this. But basically, for that class, the content for learning how to use the word processing function, possibly Excel as well, depending on what kind of subject matter it is, and also internet subject matter class. And that way, usually, at least for physical, this is done in the 9th grade, so that students get computer skills in the 9th grade and carry that with them throughout the rest of the experience. At the same time, there's over health and computer literacy. English and health at a different high school. Teachers discuss some aspects of required literature through public health issues. These are, well, in 9th grade in this school, the city requires that kids read Shakespeare. Not only we get kids to read Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet is always a little bit easier to play in a couple of versions of it, West Side Story, and at least they understand the themes and the topics. So what they did in this school was bring in issues that are relevant both to Romeo and Juliet and to teens today, such as premarital sex and gang violence. This is a school, well, it was a school, it is a city where gang violence is prevalent. So these are things that these kids know about. And talking and getting them in discussions about the differences and similarities between the situation of Romeo and Juliet and what they see in their own towns led to some really interesting compare and contrast papers. First, the discussion and putting it on paper. The kids were able to draw from their own experience to write the paper, and that really made for them math and carpentry, first example. The math teacher introduced the concept of area through the activity of redecoration. Again, this is an approach to engage students in something that otherwise, why would a kid feel that they needed to know about area and perennial question, why do I need to know this? Well, a lot of the kids got very engaged in the idea, and in terms of area, if you were going to redecorate, if you were going to redecorate, how much people you need, it really matters that they use the area of the bedroom. So this is something that they could go home and measure and get, and it's even more engaging than getting an audience at the end of the chapter. Students also measure their windows,
most of the speakers have been very different in terms of having research
the first students actually did decorate their bedrooms after this exercise.
I'm sure we'll
Even
struggle
those
for a
who didn't
while.
were very interested
It's
in
nice
drawing
when you
lots
can
of
do big.
materials so that if they were
It's kind of fun. It is.
this is what they were.
My wife was going to try to figure out how to get alive from her own, but I said, you know, honey, I don't think I could, so I'm sure.
And this was where 3 high schools competed to create the best working version of this medieval war machine. A trebuchet is an improvement on the catapult, and it was the precursor to the cannon. So you more or less get a picture of what time frame we're talking about. Kids learned the math concept behind it. They had to understand the relationship between the mass of the thing they were launching and the angle of release. And what they did was a contest with a bullseye. All the high schools brought out their trebuchet after weeks or months of building it and had a contest of who could hit the bullseye. In the other 2 schools that were in the contest, the faculty were very involved in making the decisions about where to place the trebuchet and what angle to place the levers at so that it would release and hit the bullseye. At the school in our study, the faculty drove it over in somebody's truck, took it out, they told the kids where they, put it where you want to put it, and from there on the faculty stayed over by the truck. And the kids did all the decision making, and the reason, or the way they were able to do that was that they understood the mathematics behind it. The math teacher had gone into the carpentry class and told them, what the equations were, or what were the important components to making this go where you want it to go. And after a couple of tries, they hit the bullseye. And none of the other schools did. And this is the district where they are the vocational high school. They're the ones that's where you go if you don't have any future, really. I mean, it really is that way in this district. And yet they were the ones that were able to hit the bullseye time after time after the second try because they knew how to adjust their trebuchet, whereas the faculty were pulling their hair out in the other schools and never did hit the target once. There was also a history component to this because the kids were suddenly interested in that medieval period and, what was life like back then, and if this was a new example of new technology, what else was going on in that time era that we might want to know about. So it actually engaged the kids in history as well. Curriculum integration in academies. Academic teachers still cover their topics within academies, but what they do is they'll bring in issues and themes from the academy. So an example we have here is in the Academy of Finance. At this school, the social studies and the English teachers are linked with the academy. So in a world history discussion, they were discussing the era of colonialism and slavery, and the teacher brought in the doctrine of mercantilism and how that could lead, with such a focus on trade and bringing goods to mother country and the colonies. They used that as a way of understanding how could we come to trade people. And that was one of the reasons. What they brought up was that mercantilism was sort of a doctrine of the day, and that led, they saw how that could conceivably lead to this. And it also brought a lot of discussion about current events and racism in our society. Then it was a very engaging discussion also in the world history class. In World Lit, they read Machiavelli's The Prince. So these are the kinds of things that academic side teachers can bring to the vocational or academy topics. A second example of curriculum integration in this isn't an example, but just sort of general sort of guidelines. It's not critical that your teachers have master's degrees in finance or be former nurses or any of these other things. What's important is that they be educators willing to work on refining the curriculum. And an example of this is the technology academy teachers. What they've done is year after year, as she herself has gotten more sophisticated about technology and the students coming in have gotten more sophisticated, she's been able to move down a grade in terms of what are the important aspects that you need to know. So now in 10th grade they're learning things that previously they might have been learning in the senior year. And this allows them to go further within high school. At the same time, the teacher's learning a whole lot. She was not a technology maven. She was an elementary school teacher who was just very good at curriculum development. So the principal tapped her to run the academy, and she worked with their business partner who actually had much more of the know-how. But now that they've been doing it several years, she, as I say, has gotten more sophisticated too. If a school is interested in dividing up the school into academies, which ones should they offer? Just some general guidelines. The first and foremost thing is find out what jobs are available in the local labor market. It is really important that you provide direction or provide information and experience in areas where kids can actually get jobs. One principal in our study really feels that it didn't matter so much within that guideline of the local labor market, but that it didn't matter so much what the topics of the academies were, that the important part was to provide that smallness, that connectedness and for the students, and the teaming opportunities for the teachers. He felt that students were sophisticated enough to choose from among the academies you offered regardless of what they think they want to be at that point in their life. And we did see that with one student we spoke with. She wants to be a lawyer. She wants to go into criminal justice. So we asked her how could she choose among finance, technology, and health careers. She chose what she did, which was technology. And she replied that she knew that she would learn the specifics about law in law school, but that right now she felt that the Technology Academy offered something that was important no matter what she did. And I think the same could be said of the Finance Academy and to a large extent the Health Careers Academy as well. So that's why the principal would say it doesn't matter. They're learning things that are important in sort of a generic or general way, and they'll get the specifics after high school. In terms of career pathways, should a school want to go along the career pathways route, the U.S. Department of Education and many state departments of education have identified career clusters that high schools can choose from in developing their pathways, again, depending on the local labor market opportunities. That should always be the first consideration. But if you want to see what the feds have put up, it's on this website here, www.ed.gov/offices, and then /OVAE, and then go in there and look under clusters. And they've got 16 career clusters as an example to get people thinking, or you can just adopt those, or as many of those as you want. Most schools tend to adopt 5 or 6. And again, all students can work within the options you provide. You don't need to provide every last one. Students, I was impressed at how sophisticated students are in their choices of this. Building partnerships with business, that's always a hard thing to start. If you don't have any partnerships with business at the moment, how do you begin? A good way that we found one of our schools doing is they began with civic or cultural institutions like museums or symphonies, because these organizations have boards of trustees. The boards of trustees are usually the heads of local businesses. So they begin to hear of the good works that your students are doing. Say your carpentry students are able to build an entryway to an exhibit at the museum. The board of trustees finds out about these things. And this opens the door to businesses that otherwise, if you just cold called them, might not open their doors. And usually that will begin to provide mentors, internships, job shadowing. The role of the middle school. We're finding, at least at this preliminary state, that the primary focus of CTE really is at the high school and the community college. But middle schools can help kids explore careers by job shadowing, which at this age is best done at the parents' workplace. Kids don't really know what they want to be. Even if they tell you they do, anything can happen at the middle school age. It's rare that a student goes through from middle school through post-secondary with just one idea about what they want to be, and they never change. So rather than asking them what they want to be and trying to find a position or a job shadowing experience in that field, if they just learn what work is, what do people do at work, what is work like, and they can use their parents' workplace as an example. There are also self-directed modular labs. I'm sure you've all seen them. Computer stations, and kids go from one to another as part either a whole course or a unit of an industrial arts course. And they learn, they cycle through, they work in pairs or teams, they do projects, and it's usually on things like transportation, meteorology. And they just learn what people do, what is the job like, what are they interested in, or what do they engage in those occupations. And finally, career awareness courses or units. And these are also pretty generic in nature, but very important things to learn about. How do you balance a checkbook? And these kinds of things that don't normally get taught in school, but if your parents don't teach you, then how do you learn? Making tech prep work. In our study, we found so far that the articulation agreements with the high schools have not yet begun to increase the flow of students into the community college. And there's several ways that they've found to address this. One community college began to grant the credit, the community college credit, right at the completion of the course in high school. A lot of them currently wait till the student enrolls in the community college. Sometimes they wait till they've completed a semester before they grant that extra credit, or not extra, but the community college credit that they earned in high school, but it's not granted to them till they've been in the community college a semester. And that's really not a very it doesn't motivate kids to go, whereas if you grant it to them right then and there, then they've got it, and there's more of a motivation to attend the community college because they've already earned credits there. Second, one of the other colleges is tracking student progress through the high school tech prep sequence. They are tracking it themselves, keeping a fairly close tab on the kids, and in their senior year, they invite the kids to visit the community college campus. They go to the field or the occupational department where they're a tech prep student in already, and meet and work with the faculty and students. And they found that this is one way to at least introduce them to who they might be working with in college, and at this point, we don't know yet whether that's going to increase the numbers. That's some information for the future presentation. Thank you very much for listening. As you know, our work is ongoing. It's going to be continuing for 3 more years, and we do hope that we get to come back and report some final findings and suggestions to take back to your schools. If you have any questions, there's our email addresses. Please feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you. And I think now we open it up for questions.
Minnesota. He's one of our national scholars. And Marissa, he wanted to know, when you said industry connections, did you mean for money or resources or placement on jobs? Exactly what did you mean by industry connections?
I said it a couple of times, but I think each time it's whatever the school can get. For the most part, I would say it's job shadowing, mentorships, internships, and just the opportunity to let kids who are interested in that field get to have an idea what the workplace is like. And in some cases, the kids do real work. It's, especially in the Academy school that we are studying, the kids do real work at the places. Sometimes they're just placed there to kind of job shadow and at least oversee what other people are doing. But resources as well. A lot of them. One of our schools has partnered with a company that provides them a safety officer. And they just decided they would pay for this position, and the safety officer has helped really tone down the gang influence at the school. So whatever your needs are, businesses, it's amazing. Businesses do want to help. You just need to approach them, or if you do this other route through the boards of trustees, and start working with them and seeing what they can offer compared to what your needs are. It might be nice to know what kinds of things you want or what you would like from the partnership, so that it's not just wide open. Businesses like to have things kind of laid out. They don't want to sit down and have meeting after meeting about it. They'd like to know what are the needs here, and then they can see what they can provide.
My question relates to your quantitative measures. Do you test, or are you using assessments for technical competence? Because some states have state systems for measuring competence in career technical skills.
What we're doing with the quantitative measures is we're following whatever the state's measures are. Every state everyone has to follow the core indicators. So how they play out in different states differs. So the 3 states where our schools are located, we're going to see exactly what those are. Actually, the quantitative measures will begin to be delivered to us in about a month. But there's always a delay between the collection of data from last year, which was our first full year of collecting data, and then the ability of the district to get it to us. I'm not sure exactly what they do in the meantime, but they've all told us they need this little lag time, and they can get it to us around December or January. So at that point, we're going to see exactly what are the measures that the state is using, and that's what we're going to use. So they won't be completely comparable across states, but generally.
The only thing that I would add to that, The only thing that I would add to that is that we're restricted to measures being gathered locally. We're not being allowed to go in and administer tests to hundreds of people. Federal law is going the last year or two, the last 5 years. The restrictions on going in and adding what's perceived to be burden is just, I can't do it. So obviously in middle school, in almost every state union, you have norm reference achievement tests. You move into high schools, there may be high school competency or mandatory tests of that sort. So we will gather that kind of information together with archival data on attendance, things like that, and then meld that where available and appropriate with the kind of CTE measures that you were asking about.
Just add to that, there'll be a collection of certificates. There'll be a collection of certificates that are measures of technical competence in different high schools, but there will not be, I don't think, any respect for doing measures of scans. Yes.
By the way, this is our colleague, Dr. Jim Stone from the University of Minnesota, answering the question.
But Sam's point was that we're using data that they collect, using systems records that they have. We're not going in and creating new forms of data collection.
And probably would not be allowed to do that in the year 2001 if we tried. If someone else wants to ask a question, we'll repeat the question and then.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, let me get one last chance to say anything about that.
We've got a 30-second delay, so you got to give them a little bit.
I think we wowed them.
A question on, you probably covered this earlier, but who funds this research? Because it's a fantastically big piece, and how do you decide on this stuff?
The National CTE research center at the University of Wisconsin, Minnesota. I'm sorry. University of Minnesota funds it through Vocational Education, the National Research Center. The great challenge of doing these studies, it probably costs less than you imagine to find a way to keep the cost of the study down. I think that's what makes the sampling and some of the other decisions so important. The longitudinal component becomes more or less expensive as time goes on because you don't have to identify sites anymore. It's obviously an expensive thing to do. But then as students move out of your sample and other students come back in, there's a series of decisions you have to make that could make it almost hopelessly expensive. I was involved in a study in the mid-1990s called Prospects, and the federal government mandated they actually attempt to follow a certain percentage of students who moved out of the district. And a child moved from North Carolina to South Dakota, and the cost of trying to follow them up, the cost exploded, and they had to eventually back off their requirements. So if a child moves out of the school or out of the district, we simply let them go. Did that answer your question?
Any more questions? Well, let's all show our appreciation for this excellent presentation. A couple other points I want to remind you. Our next speaker in this series will be Ivan Charner and Robin White, and they are with the other associate partner of the National Centers at the National Institute for Work and Learning, and they will be presenting on November 15th, 10 days from today. Their presentation will be at the usual presentation time, which is 3 to 4:30. Today's presentation was the exception. Most of these presentations are at 3 to 4:30, and they are all listed on our website, and I encourage you to go there. I want to mention also that Sam and Marissa had volunteered to be test of a work in progress, which is also on our website. And this is going to be used more widely, we hope, in the future, where other project directors, research project directors, will be available to answer questions from the field while their projects are in progress. Sam and Marissa's has been on the board since May. We have not had a lot of activity on that site, but we would encourage any of you watching this through the webcast or here in participation to take advantage of that and check into it in the future, because we will be adding additional sites to it. And let's see, I think I had one more point. Let me look at my notes. No, I guess that's it. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Sam and Marissa, once again, and thank you all for coming today.